Hello and welcome. My name is Neil Pease. I'm a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and it is my honor to have been invited by the Polish Center of Wisconsin in Franklin, Wisconsin, to put together and record a series of talks on the history of Poland, the lands of Poland, its peoples, and the events that have occurred throughout the 1,000 years of recorded Polish history. And this is the first of those. And what I'm going to do is to take a series of selected incidents, representative incidents, and then offer them from time to time. And the way it's going to work is this. Um, what I'm going to do is put together PowerPoint slide presentations and just sort of talk my way through it. And I hope you'll find them enjoyable and informative. Each of them will last about an hour, roughly as long as what one of my classes at UW Milwaukee would last. Um, Now, I should emphasize right at the start that any views expressed here are not those of the Polish Center of Wisconsin. They are mine and mine alone, and I alone am responsible for them. And as an introduction, I decided to try to approach the history of Poland in this way and to give a sort of overview. And you see the title that I've given it here, Poland Through the Centuries: Who, What, Where, When. Now, what's the idea behind this? Well, the idea, see, in an earlier life, before I became a college professor, I worked as a journalist. And there was an old saying in newspaper circles that a news story should answer four questions: who, what, where, and when. And it occurred to me that maybe it would be useful for starters to try to look at the long history of Poland through these ideas, because a lot of these have changed over the centuries. The Poland of now is not the Poland of 1,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, even 200 years ago. Who is Polish? Who can be considered Polish? That has changed over the centuries. What Poland is has changed over the centuries. Where it is located, you can give different answers for that, again, depending on what time you're talking about. And when, well, you're talking about history, you're talking about the passage of time. And since all of these answers have shifted, the very notion of the identity of Poland, who lives there, what kind of people, uh, what kind of country is it, does it exist at all, um, where is it located? These have all shifted. These have all shifted in very interesting ways over the centuries. And so, what I thought might be useful, just for starters, was to kind of take a look at the history of Poland in this way. So let's move on from this to the first slide. And there you see the Poland of today, the Third Polish Republic. It is a medium-sized country in Europe. It is about the size of the American state of New Mexico. It has a population of about 39 million, which is roughly the same population as California. Um, it kind of looks like the state of Ohio, just in its general contours. But this is not the Poland of history. This is not the Poland. This is a very unusual version of Poland. And it's one that has existed in many ways only in the last 75 years, since the end of the Second World War. If we take a look at this slide, which is in Polish, um, what it shows you is that the boundaries of the Poland have shifted pretty drastically from time to time. The shape of Poland, the size of Poland, where it's located on the map. Um, See here, tracing a line here. This is roughly the Poland of today, and you can see that it is smaller and lies considerably further west than Poland traditionally, which included large areas of what are now Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. As a matter of fact, at the extent, the furthest extent of its territorial expanse, um, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, roughly that you see in various shades of green here, it was roughly well, if you took New Mexico, you know, current Poland is about the size of New Mexico, well, you would have to add California to that landmass. And that would be the territorial extent of that old Poland. And that would make it the second largest country. If you put that very large Poland on the map of Europe today, it would be the second largest country in Europe, second only to Russia. But the main takeaway here is that the Poland of today, very different from what you might call the traditional historical Polish lands, considerably further to the east, taking in areas that are not part of Poland now, haven't been since 1945, and taking in areas of what's now Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. Now, where do we begin the story of Polish history? Well, you can probably begin here with the migration of the tribes and peoples who were not then Polish as we understand it now, but would become Polish over the course of the centuries. These tribes entered the territory that where roughly Poland lies today in about the 6th century AD. And what you have to remember is the identity of peoples changes over time, and the peoples who became the Poles that we know today, well, it's very much like the barbarians who entered into Europe ahead of the Slavic peoples towards the end of the Roman Empire, right? The Vandals, the Franks, and so on. Those became the modern Spanish, French, Portuguese, Germans, so on. But that took centuries to do, and that was the same here. These were not Poles as we understand it now, but they were proto-Poles. And over the centuries of cultural development and borrowings from neighbors, particularly peoples who had migrated into Europe earlier, like the Germans, they would become the modern Poles that we know nowadays. Um, in many ways, the main attribute of becoming part of what would become Europe was the adoption of the European religion of Christianity. The Poles, or Proto-Poles, entered Europe, as did all the other Slavic tribes, as pagans, but eventually they adopted Christianity. And the Poles, people who had become the Poles, adopted Christianity, as many of you will know, in the year 966 with the baptism of a Polish prince. And for this reason, 966 is often pointed to as the beginnings, it's understood as the beginnings of Polish history. Now, Poland received its Christianity in the version that was predominated in the western part of Europe, that eventually became modern Catholicism. In other words, They took on Roman Christianity, represented here by the purple that you see on the map, as opposed to Eastern, nowadays Orthodox Christianity we think of as applying to Russia and other areas of Eastern Europe. But the Poles adopted Western Christianity, and the links between Polish identity and Catholicism would become very strong over the course of the succeeding centuries. Now, by the High Middle Ages, this shows a map of Europe in 1100, it says, and you can see a sort of infant kingdom of Poland emerging roughly in the same area of Europe that it is located today. Now, again, uh, Polish identity is in the process of evolution and development. And just to illustrate that, you see, what you see here is the first written sentence in Old Polish, the earlier version of the Polish language that sort of predates the Polish that we know now, and it is a sentence, and it's indicated there in red, inserted in the middle, in the midst of an otherwise Latin text, and we can understand this because most of us were born in the United States. We speak English, and it comes as no surprise to us that the English of nowadays is quite different from the earlier versions of English that you would find in, say, the 13th century or the 15th century. Even as late as Shakespeare, that can sound a little odd to modern ears. Well, that's the same with Polish. I mean, this is a natural sort of consideration, and Polishness is still in the process of being formed by the passage of time and interaction with other peoples in Europe. Now, one of the major events in the history of Poland occurred, as many of you will know, in the late 14th century, when the Kingdom of Poland entered into a dynastic union with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a much larger Lithuania than modern Lithuania, which you see here located to the east of Poland, and taking in areas that embrace not only modern Lithuania, but Belarus and Ukraine. Lithuania was pagan, and Poland and Lithuania had been adversaries up till now, but in an effort to join forces to combat common enemies, both to west and to east, Poland and Lithuania entered into an association and essentially made an agreement. Um, Lithuania, the rulers of Lithuania, would convert their country to Catholicism, and the Grand Dukes of Lithuania would become the kings of this Polish-Lithuanian Federation. And in so doing, that began the history of what came to be known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that you see here. And this represents the Poland of its largest territorial expanse. And here on the left, you can see Poland, Lithuania, as it was in the middle of the 16th century. And there at the right, you can see Poland, Lithuania within a map of Europe. And in those days, Poland, Lithuania was in fact, at various points in its history, the largest country in Europe and one of the key countries in the continent. The importance of Poland in the European order and the key to prosperity during this period that is often referred to as the Golden Age of Polish history had to do with its importance as the principal producer and exporter of grain. Poland-Lithuania was then the breadbasket of Europe, and as you can see, as you might be able to tell from the map on the left of this slide, uh, grain would be grown, it would be harvested, and then it would be transported up the Vistula River, the Wisła in Polish, the main navigable river of Poland, and from there exported to other countries in Europe. And this was the source of the economic prosperity of Poland, and in particular for the predominance within Polish life and affairs of the landed nobility, the Polish aristocracy. And it was the aristocracy in Europe in those days that owned the land, and as a result, controlled the produce of the land. And in a largely agricultural economy and society, as the Europe of the Middle Ages and the early modern period was, this meant that the aristocracy held not just economic but political power. And this was especially so in Poland, Lithuania. The nobility amounted to only 10% of the population, but actually that was a far higher percentage than you find of nobility in other countries, such as France, where the nobility amounted to maybe 1% of the population. Uh, Collectively, the Polish nobility in the days of Poland, Lithuania, dominated the affairs of the state and of society, and and played the dominant role in the government of the country, exercised through the royal parliament, through the parliament, or Sejm in Polish. Poland was a kingdom, but as many of you may know, the country was considerably decentralized. The king tended to have few powers, and those powers could be exercised only at the sufferance of the nobility, which jealously guarded its own privileges and made certain to prevent the rise of any sort of royal government that could dominate the country, and at the expense of the role of the nobility. Now, Poland, Lithuania, the Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania. Uh, let's ask a couple of questions about that now. How Polish was the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth? The reason that I ask it is that nowadays, if we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be Polish? Who is a Pole? Well, the answer seems clear to us. To be Polish is to be Polish in the ethnic sense. That is a person of Slavic background, speaking Polish as his or her native language, considering himself or herself to be Polish in this sense, and very likely being Roman Catholic, either by religion or at least by family heritage. Well, Poland, Lithuania confounded a lot of those ideas of what it meant to be Polish. Take a look at this map, which shows well, nowadays we would call it the ethnic makeup of Poland, Lithuania in the 16th century. Now, look at those different colors, right? And you see Ukrainian, Belarusian, Polish, Lithuanian, German, Prussian, Estonian, Latvian. The population of Poland, Lithuania, about the middle of the 16th century, was about 12 million. Of these, ethnic Poles made up only about one-third of the population, only about 4.5 million. Catholics, Roman Catholics, made up only roughly the same percentage, about 4.5 million. In other words, you know, about two-thirds of Poland, Lithuania was not ethnically Polish in the way that we would understand it, nor was it Roman Catholic in the way that we have, you know, generally come to consider to be uh, Polish. Um, and that's and ethnicity wasn't even taken all that seriously in the same way that we moderns do. And as a result, Poland, Lithuania was in many ways the most cosmopolitan state in Europe, given the linguistic, the cultural, and the religious makeup of Europe. It can hardly be any surprise that Poland, Lithuania was perhaps the least oppressive country in Europe. Uh, it would have been simply impossible to impose a narrowly Polish identity on this vast and heterogeneous state. There was no serious attempt, even at the height of religious controversies in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, to impose a strict Catholicism on the country, where Catholics were in fact outnumbered by non-Catholics. Um, there was all sorts of reasons why this Poland, Lithuania, in many ways was quite different from what became the modern idea of Poland that we have today. And again, to go back to that point, ethnicity was, not taken very seriously in the sense that it was taken for granted that many different peoples of different cultures and languages made up the population of Poland. Most of the cities of Poland in these times were not predominantly Polish speaking. Cities like Danzig, the port city that nowadays is known as Gdańsk, uh, was almost entirely German speaking into the 20th century. You see here a picture of a German townsman from Danzig in those days. Krakow, the capital of Poland, was predominantly German speaking in the 16th century rather than Polish. The Polish speakers tended to live in the countryside, either as nobility or as peasants. The most famous Pole of those times, the most famous Polish scientist of the early modern period, Copernicus, probably spoke German as his mother tongue, but considered himself to be a subject of Poland. He did speak Polish and Latin with equal fluidity, but the point was that, again, ethnic identity was more fluid back then than it would be, and the sense of what it meant to be Polish was ethnically and culturally broader than we now tend to consider it. Uh, one of one of the elements in this cultural and religious mix that was Poland, Lithuania, was its emergence as the primary area of settlement and civilization of Jews in Europe. Waves of Jews entered into Poland. Uh, Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. See, sometimes going back to the idea of the Polish lands being ethnically diverse through most of its history, it is not as if Poland was the land of the Poles, of the ethnic Poles, and that all other non-Polish peoples there, like Lithuanians or Ukrainians or Belarusians or whatever, are guests. And they've lived there. They've simply lived there from time immemorial. It was simply that the boundaries of Poland came to extend over areas that included not just Poles, but these other peoples as well. Now, the exception to that rule about these peoples not migrating into Poland, the European Jews did migrate into Poland. They, of course, did not originate in the lands of Poland or Eastern Europe, but migrated in generally from Western Europe, generally as a result of waves of persecutions of Jews in areas to the west of Poland, and largely because Polish kings, Polish nobles uh, invited Jews in, who were considered in pre-modern European history to be specialists in particular elements of economic development, trade, commerce, crafts, money lending, and the like. And by about 1500, a community of Jews settled in the lands of Poland and what's now Lithuania and Belarus and Ukraine that eventually would come to embrace more than half the Jews of the world. And by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, uh, the historical lands of Poland, that is, the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that I'm talking about now, that Poland that was larger and further to the east than modern Poland, it was home to over half of the Jewish population in the world. Now, again, uh, who was Polish? Because the answer that would be given in Poland, Lithuania, was different than the one we would think of now. Nowadays, of course, if you ask the question, who's Polish? Who can we call Polish? And you would say, well, pretty much everybody who falls into that category of Polish ethnicity. That is, peoples of every class, of from high estate in life to low, who would answer to that ethnic idea of Polishness. That is, a Slav who speaks Polish, who thinks of him or herself as being Polish. Well, um, in Poland, Lithuania, typically the vast majority of the people we would now consider Polish, that is, the peasantry, the common people of the land, the farmers, in American parlance, they were not considered Polish, even though they spoke Polish, even though they were ethnically Polish. No, they didn't count in any sort of idea of who made up the Polish nation. They were simply the people who lived there, right? They were the common people. And in many ways, they didn't count. To be Polish was to be a member of the aristocracy. It was to be a member of the nobility. It was to be the one of the 10% of the landowning elite who essentially made up the political nation of Poland-Lithuania. Not only were the nobility Polish, whereas the Polish, that we would now consider Polish peasantry, the great majority of the population, they were not Polish, but because the nobles were Polish, well, they could be considered more Polish, even if by origin, by ethnic origin, they were non-Polish. If they were, say, a family of Lithuanian or Ukrainian origin who became nobles in Poland, Lithuania, and gradually took on Polish culture, they would be considered Polish, even though by ethnic origins they had not been Polish. Again, this idea of Polishness kind of uh, transcending ethnicity in some ways, similar to the typical idea of American nationality. You know, the idea that uh, that to be American, you can be of Irish background, you can be of English background, you can be of Italian background, you can be of Polish background, right? You can be of African background, and that doesn't matter. What matters is that you all swear allegiance to the ideals of the country, and that is what makes you American rather than an ancestry of blood. And in some ways, in lots of ways, this idea of Polish identity that predated, modern ethnic nationalism, that was what it meant to be Polish. Um, and here you see representatives of the Polish nobility of the old days. Now, another reason that uh, Poland gained the reputation of being the least religiously oppressive country in Europe, even in the years of the Reformation and the religious wars that followed it. Again, it had to do with a degree of religious diversity within the country that I've mentioned before. Yes, the Poles were predominantly Roman Catholic, but Roman Catholics were a religious minority inside Poland, Lithuania. Furthermore, many of the Polish nobles, at least fleetingly, adopted Protestantism during the 16th century. So again, this was a factor in the policy of Poland, Lithuania towards a sort of uh, broad-minded approach to questions of ethnicity and culture and religion. Now, as many of you will know, Poland, Lithuania ceased to exist in the 18th century. And as a result of a combination of factors of internal weakness and aggression by rapacious neighbors on its borders, you had the series of the partitions of Poland, a progressive land grab carried out in various phases that began in 1772 and ended in 1795, with the result that there was no independent Poland between 1795 and 1918, the end of the First World War. So the lands and peoples that had been Poland, Lithuania, fell under the rule of three empires. You see here the map of Europe of the later 19th century, and while you see a word Poland there, don't take that all that seriously. That simply indicates a region inside the Russian Empire that was during part of the 19th century designated as a kind of a Poland, but firmly within the Russian Empire. Uh, During the 19th century, 1795 to 1918, as I've said, there was no independent Poland, but instead you had this. This is a picture of the lands of what had been Poland, Lithuania, and as you can see here, it existed as parts of three empires. And you see there the junction of the three empires: the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire. So, in a sense, if you were going to ask the question, um, what is Poland and where is Poland? At this point, you could say, in one sense of the term, what is Poland? Well, there is no Poland. There is no Poland in the political sense. Although, even though there was no Poland in that political sense, the idea of Polishness continued to exist. If you ask the question, where is Poland? Well, you could say it's here. It's at the junction of the three partitions: the partition of Poland that's inside Germany, the partition of Poland that's inside Austria, the partition of Poland that is inside Russia. In many ways, in these years, there also was what some people called a fourth partition, and that had to do with the great migration of European peoples outside of their homeland to other parts of the world. And in the case of the Poles, what you had was a great migration, a sort of fourth partition outside of Poland and to the New World, the United States of America. And here you see some images and charts indicating immigration from Poland to the United States. Most of this happened in the later 19th century, largely the result of roughly 4 million, give or take, residents, Polish residents of what had been Polish lands, now partitioned Poland, leaving their homeland, largely to escape poverty and want inside Europe, and looking for new opportunities outside in the United States. But even if in these years Poland was non-existent in a political sense and scattered to a certain degree due to migration, as I said, the idea of Polishness continued. It did not go away. And this had to do not simply with the fact that, Poles or other residents of non-Polish residents of Poland, Lithuania, could recall that there had been for centuries a large and powerful Poland. But you also had this emerging sense in Europe in the 19th century of the solidarity of individual peoples asserting their identity. And this came to be called nationalism. This increased sense of what now we would consider ethnic identity. The idea that particular peoples have their own identities and histories. They have their own languages and cultures. And ultimately, that the ideal of each people was to gain a homeland of its own, or in the case of Poles, to regain the homeland that had been lost in 1795. Now, This was expressed in the 19th century in many ways. Sometimes in armed insurrections against the foreign rules, the partitioning powers. Uh, as in this image of one of several revolts against Russian rule in the 19th century. But very often, what you had was the preservation or the cultivation of Polish identity and Polish being in peaceful ways, in everyday ways, in education, in the maintenance of culture and literature. It was often said that in those days, Poland existed in the works of its poets and its artists, because that's where that's where you could find um, the idea of Polishness and of a Polish patriotism still expressed. Now, the debate over whether Poland should be or could be resurrected politically in the 19th century also meant that the question of what it meant to be Polish was raised again. Recall that through most of its history, Polishness had been an idea that, in some ways, did not correspond with modern ideas of ethnicity and transcended ethnicity. Uh, Ideas such as this continued in the 19th and even into the 20th century. Take a couple of examples. For instance, arguably the single most famous writer in all of Polish history is the poet Adam Mickiewicz. Well, Mickiewicz wrote in Polish, but he was born in what is now Belarus. You see a picture of his birthplace in modern Belarus, located just below his photograph there. He wrote in Polish, of course. His most famous work is the national epic Pan Tadeusz, and every Polish school child knows the opening line, Litwo, ojczyzno moja, which translates as, O Lithuania, my homeland. Here was a Polish nationalist, a Polish patriot, speaking of Lithuania as his homeland, but thinking of Lithuania as an integral part of the Poland as he recognized it. Um, it's often said of Mickiewicz that he was a Lithuanian poet who was born Belarusian and who wrote in Polish. You see on the right here a statue of Mickiewicz that stands in the city of Warsaw, the capital of Poland, which is not surprising in one sense, since he is one of the giants of Polish literature, but it's also ironic in a sense because Mickiewicz never in his life set foot in Warsaw. The only Poland that he knew personally was the Poland of the East, right? The Poland that, in many ways, the Poland that is no longer the Poland of today. This this notion of a fluidity of ethnicity could be demonstrated even in the history of one family, the noble family Sheptytsky. The Sheptytsky were a family of Ukrainian origins, and they became Polish. They became Polish nobility, and gradually took on Polish culture and identity. And by the 19th century, the Sheptytsky were still a prominent Polish noble family. And what I want to mention briefly is the divergent paths taken by three brothers, shown here in three brothers in one generation of the Sheptitskys, shown here below the family coat of arms. And these three brothers were grandsons of the Polish playwright Aleksander Fredro. But in terms of their sense of identity, they went different directions. Remember that this was a family originally Ukrainian that had become Polish over the centuries, Polish and Roman Catholic. Well, one of the brothers, the middle brother, Stanisław Szeptycki, considered himself Polish and became a high-ranking officer in the Polish army during the period of Polish independence between the two world wars. However, the eldest and the youngest brother took on religious callings, and they adopted or readopted Ukrainian identities and became associated with the Greek Catholic Church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church that most Poles regarded as theirs. The eldest brother, Andrzej Szeptycki, became the Greek Catholic Archbishop of the city that Poles knew as Lwów in western Ukraine, and is now the Ukrainian city of Lviv. And the youngest brother, Clemente, became a Greek Catholic monk and is regarded by the church, by the Greek Catholic Church, as a blessed and a martyr to communist power after the Second World War. However, these notions of, if you want to call it, ethnic ambiguity, gradually were overtaken by the more narrowly ethnic notion of nationalism. So the various peoples who had made up the mosaic of old Poland, Lithuania, went separate ways. And what you had was the crystallization of a sense of a Polish identity, a Lithuanian identity, a Ukrainian identity, eventually a Belarusian or White Russian identity, all distinct and separate from that of the Poles. And eventually, this is what led to the creation of separate homelands for all of those peoples. Now, we're getting close to the end now. Don't worry. The First World War resulted, as many of you know, First World War fought from 1914 to 1918. Shook up the map of Europe that had existed in the 19th century and brought down all three of the empires that had dominated the lands of the former Poland, Lithuania, and the rest of Eastern Europe, for that matter. The German Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire no longer existed at the end of the First World War. And in the place of those empires, there arose a belt of new or recreated countries in Eastern Central Europe that you see on the right side of this slide. And of course, one of those countries was a newly independent Poland, the Second Polish Republic. Now, this independent Poland still raised the question of who was Polish, because the Poland of the period between the two world wars was still a Poland that took in large parts of the lands to the east of where Poland is now, where primarily not ethnic Poles, but other peoples lived. You see here a linguistic map of interwar Poland that shows that about two-thirds of the population of Poland in the early 20th century was ethnically Polish, meaning, of course, that the remaining one-third was not. It was neither Polish nor Roman Catholic. You see here, for instance, a map that shows large areas of Ukrainian settlement, of Belarusian settlement, pockets of Germans and Lithuanians and Czechs. And that doesn't even include, this map doesn't even include the 10% of the population of Poland in those days that was Jewish, the largest Jewry in all the world, about 3 million out of a total population of 25 to 27 million. Now, uh, who could be considered fully citizens in this Poland? And here again, you had two answers that were put forward by the dominant political personalities of the first half of 20th century Polish history. On the one hand, you had Józef Piłsudski, in many ways the most important figure in Polish political life, who argued that one could be Polish and not be ethnically Polish, right? The Poland that Piłsudski foresaw was a Poland that resembled the sort of polyglot, cosmopolitan Poland of the past, one in which Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, and others could coexist peaceably, and they would all be equally regarded as rightful citizens of modern Poland. That view was contradicted by the faction of the nationalist right, represented here by its most prominent spokesman, Roman Dmowski. And Dmowski and the Polish nationalists argued for a Poland that was of, by, and for ethnic Poles, one that would limit, to the extent possible, ethnic minorities and their influence, and in particular looked very skeptically at the large Jewish minority and more gravitated towards openly anti-Semitic views. This debate continued to go on, and ultimately it wasn't settled by the Poles themselves, but it was settled, at least so far as we know, in brutal and bloodthirsty fashion by the Second World War, which broke out in Europe in 1939 and commenced with an attack by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on Poland, and subjected the lands of Poland and also of those formerly Polish territories of Lithuania, Belarusia, and Ukraine to a hellish existence for the coming 6 years. However, the ending of the war in many ways brought into being the type of Poland that we recognize today. Of course, the essential political decisions determining the fate of Poland were not made by Poland itself, but by outside powers, particularly the Soviet Union, which on the one hand both liberated Poland from German Nazi occupation, but also brought with it an occupation of its own and transformed Poland, as well as the rest of Eastern Europe, into a virtual satellite empire for the coming 50 years. One thing that happened as a result of this was a wholesale redefinition of boundaries, national boundaries in Eastern Europe, and this was nowhere more dramatic than in the case of Poland, because the Soviet Union annexed what had been Eastern Poland, territories that for most of the preceding 1,000 years had been considered part of Poland. Poland was compensated by the addition of territories taken from Germany and added on to Poland in the west, resulting in the fact that Poland, the new Poland, was figuratively simply moved about 200 miles from east to west, creating the boundaries of Poland that we know today. Now, moreover, Poland was subjected not simply to forced boundary changes and to a communist regime that was imposed on the country, but it also underwent several waves of ethnic cleansing intentionally designed by the new communist regimes in Eastern Europe, including communist Poland, as well as the Soviet Union, to eliminate ethnic minorities insofar as possible, with the result that remaining Germans in the new Poland were forcibly expelled from the country. And Poland and the Soviet Union exchanged Polish and Ukrainian populations, with the Soviets expelling Poles from Soviet-ruled areas of Belarus and Ukraine into Poland, and Poland shipping off Ukrainians elsewhere as well. The result was the creation of the Poland within the Eastern Europe that we see today. That is not simply Poland, but mostly all of East Central Europe had been heterogeneous and polyglot and multi-ethnic in the way that I've been describing the historical Poland, with the result that now you have a Poland that is, well, the Poland that you see here, and that represents the Poland that is further west than Poland ever has been in the past, and also a Poland that is more ethnically compact than it ever has been in its history before. Contemporary Poland, as a result of war and genocide and ethnic cleansing and the flight of refugees, is now more homogeneous than ever in its history. It's estimated that anywhere from 95 to 97% of contemporary Poland is ethnically Polish. And this brings us back to our starting point, the Poland of today. Now, again, what is the takeaway here? The Poland of today is recognizably the Poland of previous centuries, and the Poland of today can clearly find its historical roots in the various incarnations of Poland that we have seen going back into 1,000 years of history. But this history has been eventful. It has been at times tragic. It has been it has had periods of great national achievement. It has run the gamut. It is one of the more colorful histories that one will find of any country and people in the history of Europe. And I hope that you will join me in coming installments to investigate more slices and episodes in the history of Poland through the centuries. Thank you for your attention, and see you later. Bye.